Welcome to Mooney Reads, and welcome to a wrap-up video. For the majority of this year, I haven't really been able to put together monthly wrap-ups. So for my reading from March through July, I'm gonna be just kind of putting all the books together. My fiction wrap-up has already been posted by the time you see this. So this is going to be all of the nonfiction books that I've read over the past 5 months. I've organized these kind of by topic or genre. I'm going to talk about my ones that are a little bit more about politics or adjacent to that before going into memoirs and then self-help. There are a couple that kind of could be on this list that ended up in fiction, including a translated anthology that includes fiction and nonfiction, lesbians in Germany, and poetry, which is sometimes fiction, sometimes nonfiction, often a little bit of both. So if any of that interests you, you can take a peek at that video. So I'm going to start off with a couple of books written in the early 2000s, including Addicted to War, Why the U.S. Can't Kick Militarism, which is a graphic nonfiction that kind of goes through the United States kind of history with militarism and increased military spending, putting their nose in a bunch of stuff that they don't need to, overthrowing some governments, bombing the shit out of civilians, that sort of thing. So this was a really good collection and has a lot of really good sources to look into as well. It's a short little intro, but it was really good. And after that, I read Terrorism and War by Howard Zinn. This is about the U.S.'s meddling in Afghanistan and all of that post 9/11. This is a series of interviews, more or less, and there's just so much really good stuff in here. I've been really wanting to read through more of Howard Zinn's stuff, and I'm glad I read this one. And both of these I actually vlogged reading. The vlog is not published yet because it is going with my reread of The Hunger Games. So I'm rereading The Hunger Games while also reading nonfiction that is about topics that inspired or is surrounding or adjacent to the series. And I'm trying to focus more on stuff that would have been published at the time. So I've only reread the first book so far, and I actually need to locate my copies of the other two. So hopefully that'll be up sooner rather than later, but don't hold your breath. However, if these are of interest, there is more to come. After that, we reach further into the backlist with The Medium is the Message, which was such an interesting read. This uses a lot of different imagery in order to talk about how the medium influences kind of the message of what we're looking at, or changes it on a fundamental level. This was really neat, and I feel like it's one that I should maybe like reread and meditate on more. I know that at least one of the authors has written something that's a little bit more in depth, that from the reviews did not maybe end up being as successful or successfully relaying some of the ideas as this one, but I'm still kind of maybe interested in reading kind of the expanded version in some ways. But one of the things that I found that was really profound about this was how this was published quite a while ago at this point, and yet it remains so relevant, and taking a lot of what this says and applying it now, especially with the way that social media works, who owns these websites, all of this, it's scary. It's terrifying, to be honest. After that, I have something a little more contemporary. It's been published in the last couple of years. The Exvangelicals by Sarah McLuhan, which it has memoir elements, but it also has a lot of like journalisty elements. The author of this is someone who's been closely following the conservative movement and is like on to MAGA rallies and all of this sort of thing. And she also has a personal background in the evangelical church. So she is going around and talking to different people who also used to be evangelicals and has since either gone to a different denomination or have stepped away from religion entirely. And so she's kind of talking about this political moment. But of course, in order to do that, she also goes a little bit over history of how evangelicals even became such a force politically, looking back at like Reagan era politics and stuff like that. So this was really good. It makes me even more excited to read Jesus and John Wayne, which has been on my TBR for a while, which kind of digs into that part of it a little bit more. But it was really neat seeing kind of the contemporary iteration of this kind of laid out like that. So, like with all of the books I've talked about so far, very interesting, very enlightening, deeply terrifying. Then the next book that I have, I would say is more psychology, definitely firmly a psychology book. However, I've put it kind of with the political books because out of the three categories it makes the most sense here. And also because it is directly tied to political happenings. And that is Gender Without Identity. This is one that I had a really like fun time digging into. Before I even read the book, I watched several interviews and discussions with the authors. This is a work of psychoanalysis, which I am not well versed in, which is why I watched a bunch of stuff by the authors before I read it. I also watched a little bit of like introductory videos kind of about psychoanalysis, and I'm still not an expert, but I did glean enough to be able to read through this, and it's very interesting. This basically looks at the idea of gender as kind of something that evolves and something that can be related to trauma, but insofar as kind of the psychoanalytic perspective of like kind of that's how lots of tenets of ourselves are evolved. So gender for anybody kind of maybe is not unique in that way, and certainly gender whether you're cis or transgender, it's not really unique in that way either. And the reason that they wrote this and what made it such like a scandalous thing for them to publish, I suppose, within their discipline is that some of the prominent right-wing groups in multiple countries, but I think particularly the UK and US, they come from psychoanalysis, or they use psychoanalysis to kind of justify transphobia, turfiness, and that sort of thing. And they kind of use certain ideas and twist them to make them seem like there's something that's unique to trans people. And throughout the course of this book, they're basically saying that it's not unique, and that this is something that should be like addressed and used to support trans people, rather than shit on them and try to completely exclude them from public life. And I hate that I did not like take more notes or do something while I was reading this, because I was so stoked. Like, basically, before I read it through like the first maybe 3/4 or 2/3 of the book, but it was just really unfortunate timing. And when everything was happening with my brother, who passed away in March, this was one of the books I was in the middle of, and I did finish it while my brain was like scrambled eggs, more or less. So I didn't retain what I would have liked to, and some of the things that I thought are kind of lost to the ether. So, this is one that I would definitely like to reread, just because it does seem like a really important text for the discipline that it is in, and actually an important thing too. So we have that there are some TERFs trying to use psychoanalysis to say things that they're arguing don't really hold water. But additionally, they tried to publish an iteration of this, or a part of this, in a prominent journal, and because they wouldn't change a footnote, something that really, I forget the details, but if you're interested, I'll put one of their interviews where they talk about it in the place where links go. I'm pretty sure it was something about how the history of psychoanalysis has not been kind to queer people. Because they wouldn't take that out, they were refused publication and were in limbo for a really long time. So I thought that was really interesting. This is cool. I don't know that it's one that I would recommend to the random person, but if this is adjacent to your niche, if you're super into psychology or well-versed in psychoanalysis, or are like me and are willing to, kind of dig into stuff before getting to it, this was a really interesting read. After that, we can dig into some memoirs. I listened to the audiobook of The House of My Mother by Shari Franke. Earlier this year, her mother was indicted in a really horrendous child abuse case. If anyone's familiar with 8 Passengers, it was a family vlogging channel, and this book is written by the eldest daughter. So she talks about being basically on camera a decent portion of her life, kind of what it was like living with her mom, who was very narcissistic and abusive in these different ways, even before she kind of went down the culty pipeline that exacerbated all of that and made it worse for her younger siblings. So this had a lot of really interesting insight and made me think a lot of Joel Duggar's memoir that I read last year, as well as Britney Spears. Those had a lot of connections, and I saw some of those connections also in this one. I also thought that the way that she wrote this was really respectful to her siblings, because a big part of this was talking about how that invasion of privacy is just awful. So the only siblings that she really goes into detail about are her and her adult brother, who consented to being in the book. And then the majority of her other siblings she kind of was more vague about and didn't even list by name, I don't think. So she talks about kind of the experience of growing up like that, and also subsequent abuses that she faces because of the way that she was raised and because other people are just really horrendous. So that was a really good and interesting memoir. Another memoir that I read was Sipping Don Perignon Through a Straw by Eddie Ndopu, who is a South American disabled activist and speaker. And he is talking about his experience getting education and getting to where he was as a speaker. His family immigrated to South America, and he had a really hard time getting into school because there is no accessibility kind of built into this. So he had to really push to even be included. And then when he got into schools in the UK, it was an extra fight to kind of get everything there, and talks about the issues that he had, especially as someone who really needed full-time help and care, and about how, universities, I feel pay a lot of lip service to the idea of having accessibility and different things like this, but he really still ended up facing a lot of barriers, especially with funding and things like that. And on top of all of this going on with school and everything else, he also talks about being queer and relationships that he had with different people, both in terms of like missed relationships and people acting weird, but also like finding love and stuff like that. So there's a lot to this one, and it was really good. Both of these I read, actually all three of the memoirs that I read on audio, and they were really great, and I would recommend all of them on audio. And the final memoir that I have is Wintering, which I think is actually, maybe it should go in self-help. It doesn't really matter too much, to be honest. This has memoir elements as well as like kind of self-helpy stuff. The author wrote this after basically going through a massive burnout and like a bunch of health problems caused by work stress and autistic burnout. And throughout the course of this, she talks about different ways to look at rest. This includes meditating on things in nature, looking at stuff like hibernation, but also talking about different like cultural rituals that she learned about traveling while she was on kind of this work hiatus, looking at saunas and different things like that. So this was a really chill book to listen to overall. I had a pretty good time with it, and it was very relaxing. The only part that was not relaxing was the jump scare when she casually mentioned Margaret Thatcher near the end of the book as like an example of something. So I hated that. And just had to say that. The rest of the book up into that point was really good though, and made me think a lot, especially in a time when I was, like I said, scrambled egg brain. That was around the time I was listening to a lot of audiobooks. Not The House of My Mother. I don't think I could have stomached that one when I was in that kind of headspace, but definitely did listen to Wintering then, and it was a good choice. After that, we get into some more self-helpy stuff, including How to Eat Well for Adults with ADHD. And I initially picked this one up because I saw that it had tips for making grocery lists and overcoming overwhelm in the kitchen. Very relevant. But a lot of this actually talks about intuitive eating, which I had like heard of and had kind of been in the process of changing my relationship to food. So this one ended up helping with way more than I thought it would. I think this would be really helpful for a lot of different neurodivergent people. If you have issues with interoception, it talks about that specifically. I think this is a really good like food book for people who have experienced disordered eating, and it just explained things in a really great way, made me think a lot, and has a lot of stuff that I intend to come back to, which is why it was still sitting on my shelf. I will say the one caveat, like the one thing that I didn't like, is that there is a very small section within this, it's maybe only like a couple of paragraphs, that uncritically mentions AI. I hate that. I am really glad that it's a very small section and it's very like kind of inconsequential to the majority of it. I also kind of wish that some of the studies that she mentions towards the beginning were properly referenced. Like she talks about them, but then there's not always a citation. There are lots of other helpful resources in this. But picky academic brain says, where's the specific survey? But other than that, this does have some really helpful advice, and I liked it a lot. I also read Unmasking for Life, which is the follow-up to Unmasking Autism, which was one of my favorite books the year that I read it. Unmasking for Life was also incredible. This one is more practical. I think that it has a lot of good, not just journal entries, but also examples that I think make a lot of what he's saying more digestible. So this is about what you can do when you're in situations where you can unmask, how you can build more confidence, more or less. I found it to be really helpful. I will definitely be revisiting it. And I think a lot of the skills that he talks about in here, even if you're not someone who is able to unmask or can really unmask in a lot of settings, I think that a lot of the tenets that he's really going into, or a lot of the main skills, that's the word, the main skills that he's talking about really honing, are going to be really important for anyone, particularly people who are neurodivergent. And after that, I read Running on Empty, which looks at childhood neglect and talks about a lot of the ways in which people can experience emotional neglect, a lot of the reasons. It uses a lot of examples to talk about ways that people often accidentally can have these emotional kind of ramifications on their children, a lot of which can even come from their own emotional neglect or other neglect and abuse that they'd experienced. So it gives a lot of insight on identifying that and a bit on how to deal with that or how to unlearn some of those behaviors. It was interesting. There are a lot of examples, but I do think that there was not quite enough meat around the examples. I think it should have gone further. I also don't think that it looked at things like race, queerness, and kind of other things that would influence all of this and the dynamics. I think I gave it like a 3 or maybe a 3.5, depending on how nice I was feeling that day. I don't know. It's not bad for an intro on the topic. It would have just been nice to have something more expansive, I think. Very quickly before I run out of space, I read a few children's nonfiction books that I looked at to give my younger sister. These are all on grief. Why Do I Feel Sad is a good one to read in a sitting that kind of talks about grief in multiple dimensions. When Dinosaurs Die is very comprehensive and would be good to take bite by bite, but goes into a lot of different things and also talks about multiple faith practices when it comes to grieving. And then my grief comfort book is an activity book that has a lot of stuff that's really good for kids, but also very good for adults. So all 3 of these were solid, and I got them for my sister. And so that was all the nonfiction that I've read over the past few months. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these or any other good nonfiction. If you're interested in my fiction reads, I have that video up too. And thank you all so much for watching. Bye.